I never saw Leigh do anything unkind or cruel. Throughout the whole time of the holidays every year, the cruelest he was ever to me, or that I saw him be cruel to anything, was when he was with that boy that night in 1962. They had the tent up and there was a campfire going, and the car was parked a little bit further away, facing away, and they were cooking some food, and I spent some time at the campfire. And then the other boy said to me, "We've got a body in the car." And I can't remember what was said. I must have shown some disbelief, because I remember being over at they opened the boot of the car and looked in, and there was just tins of petrol, or tins of something, I don't know on. A few other things. And then I confronted him. I can't remember that I didn't say, said something like, "You're a liar," because he went round then to the back seat of the car, back door of the car on the left-hand side, and opened the car door. And said to look. And I did look, and there was tarp or blanket of some sort, and there was bumps underneath it. But I couldn't see there was a body, and so I think I said something like, "It's not." And then Leigh called to me from the other side of the car, and he'd opened the back door and told me to come here. And then he moved the blanket tarp back over the head of a boy laying in the back seat of the car. And he had wet here. His eyes, well, I didn't see his eyes, but I could see his head, and wet here. And I remember I did look a little bit close and see a face. He was European. I don't remember anything else was said, but what I do remember was that he said, "So you better go home, little girl, or I might shove something up your bumhole and bury you, murder you and bury you like we're doing with him." And I'd looked to Leigh to see if there was any help. But he just sort of had a defiant look on his face, like I'd never seen him look before.
These events have remained unresolved since 1962. The Leigh this woman refers to is now serving a life sentence for a murder committed in Tasmania in 1975, 13 years after the incident she described.
I spent almost 20 years in the Victoria Police Force, most of that in the Major Crime Squad. I worked on the Costigan Royal Commission, the Hilton Hotel, Turkish Consulate and Russell Street bombings. Soon after I moved back to Tasmania in '98, I read an article in the Hobart Mercury. It concerned some prisoners who were allowed out of Hayes Prison Farm on weekends to go fishing in the Derwent River. The article focused on one prisoner, James Ryan O'Neill. He was serving a life sentence for the murder of a boy in 1975. This bloke was fascinating. He'd arrived in Tasmania in November 1974 and murdered a 9-year-old boy at Eagle Hook Neck in early February '75. In April, he murdered another boy and in the intervening period of 2 months, he unsuccessfully tried to abduct at least another 5 boys. It was a very strong pattern, and all my experience told me that a person doesn't just arrive in a new state, then start killing and abducting. There had to be previous crimes. I wrote to Jim and told him a bit about myself. I said I'd like to come out to Hayes and talk to him about his life. He wrote straight back, agreeing to meet me. That was the start of my journey. So, Jim, you've spent over a quarter of a century in the prison system, 26 and a half years, somewhere about there. How have you found it?
Well, I haven't got any older. I've deliberately not had a birthday since I came in.
How old were you when you came into the prison system?
27.
And now 54?
Yeah, I was born in Melbourne, 47. Went to school, Scotch College, Caulfield Grammar. Scotch College was a very upper-class boarding school, which I did not like.
Did you enjoy schooling?
No. No. And no again. I suppose, you know, reasonably normal, uneventful sort of childhood. Father was in real estate, which I followed him into after leaving school. We used to go away on annual holidays, fishing trips. One of my favourite places, since I was very, very young, was Johanna River, the Western District of Victoria, Cape Otway area. We used to go camping down there at least every year. We knew all the farmers, the families in the area.
And I suppose, by any chance, did any of those farmers happen to have some nice daughters?
You got a one-track mind, you know that? Yes, they did. I mentioned at the beginning of this that I learned fishing and shooting and other things, and the other things had quite a bit to do with one particular daughter of this farmer, yes.
I think I was probably about 6 when I saw the father, Leigh's father, called to him in a really harsh, demanding tone, authoritative, like sergeant in the army type tone of voice. "Leigh, come here." And I remember seeing Leigh having to walk towards his father with all this fear in his face. The father had a stick about 30 centimetres long, and he got hold of Leigh by the arm and started belting him hard with the stick, hard enough that he swung off the ground.
It was obviously an unhappy household, your mum and dad.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong here. Your mother had a problem with the booze?
Yes, and still does.
Oh, she's still good. Oh, yeah, it's still going. Jim O'Neill's father had been a prisoner of war. He had a lot of problems. Jim's mother was a much younger woman and apparently a pretty bad alcoholic. They fought violently, and the police were called to their house in Brighton on many occasions. Jim dropped out of his real estate course at Pran Tech and set himself up as a gun dealer. Round about this time, he got himself tangled up with some notorious underworld figures. People like George Joseph, the man who supplied the gun that killed anti-drugs campaigner Donald Mackay.
I don't care what anyone says, nice fella.
Who were the other people that you come in contact with?
To a much lesser, much smaller extent, Trimboli. Pseudo mafia, you know what I mean? They like to portray that sort of attitude. There's such a great deal that went on in Melbourne that never came to light. It was only sort of known by those involved, and I'd grown up in Melbourne, you know, gone to good schools and that, and I had no inkling of what actually went on. And all of a sudden I was introduced to a world where judges could be bought, where police officers could be bought, and not just bought, but actively engaged in the criminal activities.
I got the feeling Jim liked his money quick and easy. He branched out into a new line of work. He started buying uncut opals and selling them to jewellers in Melbourne. It must have paid him pretty well, because he made a lot of road trips backwards and forwards to Cooper Pedy between 65 and 67. How many such trips approximately would you have made?
Oh, that's hard to estimate exactly, but quite a few. 15.
Yeah.
Could have been more.
And how many vehicles would you have worn out in that period?
7 or 8.
Just right.
Because, I mean, you know, to get stranded out there was you could go for several days and see no one. I have actually made trips up there where you leave Port Augusta, turn off towards Woomera, and not see another vehicle for the entire rest of the trip.
Yeah.
All the horror stories that I'd been told about Cooper Pedy, I mean, I know they happened, and they even happened while I was up there, but...
What were some of the horror stories that you heard about?
Well, people would just disappear.
We were talking about Cooper Pedy, and he clammed up on me. This wasn't the first time he'd done it. I started to think to myself, what's he done in the mid-60s in South Australia that he doesn't want me to know about? In all the time I'd spent talking to Jim, he'd maintained that he'd never had any trouble with the police before he was arrested in Tasmania. Not even a speeding ticket. I'd heard some stories about an incident with some kids in Victoria, but I never had any hard facts. Then one day, out of the blue, he handed me a copy of his '96 parole assessment. I've got no idea why he did this, because on page 3 are details of 12 charges against him for abduction and indecent assault on 4 boys in Melbourne in 1971. I'd spent a lot of time with Jim O'Neill and I felt I was getting far too close to him. So I decided to see if he'd talk more openly to someone he'd never met before.
I read in the files, when I read the whole case and the parole board reports, that there were accusations, and only accusations, that things that happened in Melbourne with boys.
Well, this I cannot say.
Right, okay.
I'm under...
legal.
Yeah.
Did you have a chance to talk to the parole board?
I have had, yes.
Did they imply to you that that you were sexually interested in boys, and were you able to answer that?
Oh, I denied it and said, well, there are no... there are no proven incidents of that whatsoever.
Yeah. How would you describe your sexuality? Would you say you're just a
Yeah.
heterosexual man? Or?
Yep. Not of recent years. More like a monk.
Right, right. But in the past,
yeah.
you'd see yourself as being a...
Yes.
Yeah.
And demonstrably so.
Yeah, right.
I mean...
but wouldn't people say, I'm sorry to hark back, but I think it's important, that there were boys in the 2 cases and in the 1 case. Why boys? Just accident? Happened to be there?
I have no idea.
Right.
None whatsoever.
Right. You had an accident, didn't you? A gunshot
That's right,
accident.
yeah. I was a licensed gun dealer.
Oh, okay.
In
okay.
Victoria.
Yeah.
I had a partner at the time, and we'd purchased a 32 Beretta, which wasn't feeding properly. And he was, stupidly I suppose, cycling live rounds through the mechanism, and one discharged, and it hit me right there. It was later taken out in hospital. It had gone back through my skull, done a bit of damage there, gone down through my, it turned, went down through my throat and lodged in my neck.
But that led to a lot of blackouts, didn't it?
Well, I think a more proper description of what they were was an unaccounted for period of time.
Right, yeah.
And,
Jim O'Neill's in jail for a murder he reckons he can't remember because of the gunshot wound. But I had a strong feeling that his problems began a lot earlier than that.
It's about the worst possible thing that could happen if you've got someone who's already antisocial and then you damage his frontal lobe, because he's already got limited control over impulses. And the frontal lobe is where the control over impulses resides. So if you knock that out, he's going to become even more disinhibited than he would have been beforehand, even more impulsive.
I found out from the trial documents that as a child Jim O'Neill was prone to fantasies. There are instances of cruelty to animals, dishonesty, arson and truancy. On top of that, there was also a strong inference from one of the psychiatrists that Jim himself had been sexually molested as a child, probably by someone close to him.
You talked about your father. How was your relationship with your mother? You said you had a fairly good relationship with your father. I mean, you know, you got on reasonably well with your mother. Was that so?
yeah.
What, just couldn't get close, or got too close?
Look, can we skip this one?
That body language is so interesting. Head goes left, he's going to lie. Head goes right, how am I going to get out of this one?
Yeah.
Following your shooting in Victoria, can you take us through a chronological sequence of events?
No, Gordon, I can't without...
Right. Sorry?
See, if I mention that, it's going to position it.
Jim jumped bail before he could face trial for the boys in Victoria. He headed to the west and disappeared off the radar for quite a while. At first, Jim talked openly about his time in the west. He told me about how he'd worked on cattle stations around Fitzroy Crossing. But then, for some reason, he started to get real evasive. He said that on legal advice, he wouldn't say where he'd been or when he was there. He told me he was worried that one day the police might find something and plant his DNA on it. Only a man with something to hide would make such a comment.
What was your real name? Bridgart, B-R-I-D-G-A-R-T.
And your Christian name?
Leigh Anthony, L-E-I-G-H.
L-E-I-G-H. Yeah. So why did you change?
Look, I really don't know. I didn't conceal my movements, Gordon. I mean, you know, my friends, my family and all that knew exactly where I was and what I was doing.
I talked to people up there, and it surprised me how many of them remembered Jim O'Neill. He apparently spent a lot of time hanging around the Fitzroy Crossing pub. It was there that he met, then married a young Tasmanian barmaid. I found one bloke who actually went to the wedding.
Well, I suppose the first time I really run into him properly was he came up to Fitzroy Crossing, and he wasn't actually doing anything, just in the bar there for quite a while, and he actually met one of the barmaids, Carol, at that stage, and they ended up getting married, and to this day I still don't know whether anybody, got up and told Carol that, the things that people were saying about a husband or a future husband. I was working for the Department of Agriculture at that stage out at the research station. We had a research station 23 mile out of town, and the next minute he ended up there as manager, and I certainly wasn't happy about working for him.
How did he get the job?
Yeah, Jim could tell a pretty good story. It was full of shit, basically. So, and he would just go in there and he would have spun a yarn and said that he had done that, and they probably wouldn't have done a decent check-up on him.
Did you notice a scar on Jim's head?
Well, he told us about that. Like, he'd been shot, and he told us it was in Vietnam that it happened, and apparently the bullet went in here and out through the back of his head there, and it was a war wound from Vietnam that we heard.
I got on the phone to an old bloke who'd been a JP up there. He had no time for Jim at all. And there was something else. He told me about the unsolved death of an Aboriginal boy in November 73. An Aboriginal? Was it a young fellow?
Yeah, he was found wrapped in barbed wire around a log, and he was actually found up a tree once the river subsided, but it just went down as a tribal killing, to the best of my knowledge.
There weren't any records about the boy's death. No official inquest, no newspaper stories, nothing. And it was pretty clear some people didn't appreciate me raising the subject. Was there any deaths up there at all that you thought was a bit suspicious at the time O'Neill was up there?
No, there was some black fella tied on a log floating down the river, but that, that's a sort of black fella caper. It was something you wouldn't take any bloody notice of. But he evidently had a bit to do with the gin, so.
Where did you hear that?
Oh, well, that was him and his mate at the races got tangled up with gins.
The Mullajar community is located near some of the stations that Jim worked on. A few of the elders remembered him, but they're gentle people, and I got the feeling they wouldn't speak ill of anyone.
He'd always kept to himself.
Yeah. Do you remember what his name was?
Jim, eh?
Yeah.
Didn't know his surname, but that's what I knew.
Yeah, Jim O'Neill. Can you remember what sort of bloke this fella was?
He was good bloke.
Some of them gave the impression that Jim was just another white fella, but I got a nagging feeling things weren't quite right. Things became clearer when I talked to the owners of Fossil Downs, one of the big stations where Jim worked for a while as a storeman. For someone who only worked there for a couple of months, more than 30 years ago, he seems to have made quite an impression on them.
We found no fault with Jim's work. It was more the moral issue, I suppose, that prompted us to ask him to go, because in due course it came out, because the native girls can never keep secrets. They said that Jim was paying for their favours by giving them bacon and drinks.
Who's that fella, do you reckon?
Jim O'Neill. He's a guy that used to work on another property told me he'd said that he'd done the Beaumont job. It's Beaumont Children in South Australia, and at the time I thought he was too young to be involved at all, and didn't take much notice of it.
Now, there was Another young Aboriginal boy found dead in the river somewhere around Fitzroy Crossing. Did somebody tell you something about that?
No. We just, you hear of people dying, but not the, we didn't hear of the, we probably heard about it, but we didn't hear of any of the detail of it. If we did, we'd forgot, you know, I've forgotten.
Right. I thought you'd said to me on the phone that one of the workers had told you that Jim had spoken about killing an Aboriginal boy.
No, not. I've said nothing like, well, that wasn't me, because I don't know anything about that.
Right. He apologised to me the next day. He said there were some things better left unsaid. I thought I'd give you a ring and see whether it's all right. I decided to have a talk to Norm Adams. He'd been a policeman in Fitzroy Crossing, and when I talked to him a couple of days earlier, he'd mentioned the boy in the river. With the wire, what was the guts of that? Never heard of it before? No, that's right. Oh, well, if you never heard of it, there's... Norm didn't want to talk, but I found out there was another policeman in Fitzroy Crossing at the time Jim was there. He died a few years ago, but his wife was happy to talk to me. She didn't remember the boy in the river, but she had plenty to say about Jim O'Neill.
Soon as Trevor met Jim O'Neill, he said, "I don't trust that bloke. He's a sly man. It's written all over him." He said, "There's something not right about that bloke." He didn't like the way he hung around the children, particularly Norm Adams's boys. On one occasion, he asked Norm to let the boys, and they had a daughter, Vicky, a bit younger, spend the night out there, and Trevor did ask Norm not to let them go, but he did. Trevor was very, very angry about the whole episode. And we went out there the next day and had this barbecue, and a bit of a stressful day. Carol was terribly upset. She thought the marriage was a sort of a sham, and she didn't say straight out that he belted her around, but she certainly intimated that he did. He used to tell these outrageous stories. He reckoned the wound in his head, naturally somebody would inquire about it.
Yeah.
He told one story that his mother's boyfriend was a gangster and that he had shot him in the head.
Jim O'Neill told a pack of lies when he was in the Kimberley. Apart from the fact he told people he was a drover when he couldn't ride a horse, he also said he was an accountant, a Vietnam veteran, a bush lawyer, and even an ASIO agent. By all accounts, Jim wasn't much of a manager, and eventually the department moved him sideways to Derby. By this time, his wife was 3 months pregnant. He left Fitzroy Crossing in August '74. Within weeks of him arriving in Derby, a young boy disappeared off the street.
A few years back, a friend of mine was telling me that a little boy went down to a shop and to get something around tea time and never ever returned home again. I don't remember what year that was. I just remembered him telling me this, and it's just stuck in my head ever since. This fella said he was 12-year-old when he went missing. The shop he went to has been gone from there maybe 10 years, maybe more.
According to a missing persons report, this boy was last seen getting into a car driven by a European man outside Elder's store in Derby. He'd just been to the local shop. It's the exact same thing that happened in Tasmania. The first boy disappeared after going to the shop to get a carton of cigarettes for his father. The second boy was getting a carton of milk. Jim only stayed in Derby for a couple of months. In November, he and his wife moved to Tasmania. At that time, it was the only state in the country he hadn't been to. He killed the boy at Eaglehawk Neck in early February '75. On the same day, he brought his wife and newborn son home from hospital.
We came down from the Kimberleys, directly to here. We arrived in, I think, about the middle of November '74. and I was in prison on the 2nd of May 75, so it wasn't long, no.
One of the detectives who arrested and charged Jim O'Neill is now the Tasmanian Police Commissioner. He was a junior detective sergeant in early 75 when he and his partner tracked Jim and his wife to a motel in Launceston. True to form, Jim was about to leave the state.
When the second boy disappeared off the street, he was doing a paper run, and his disappearance sparked a great deal of concern. There was anger, there was fear, there was a great deal of media speculation that there was perhaps a serial killer operating in Tasmania, and of course that turned out to be very much the case. We discovered that in the fortnight prior to the second boy disappearing, that there were probably 4, if not 5, other children who'd been picked up, taken to remote locations, who'd managed to escape the person that had abducted them and get away relatively injury-free. O'Neill at that time was a barman at the Louvre Hotel, which is the Eagle Hawk Neck Hotel, and of course he was a very dominant influence in the search and offered all sorts of advice and assistance, and of course the investigation later proved that he had picked the boy up on the day that he was due to bring his wife home from hospital from having their first child. He obviously saw this kiddie playing in the washway, somehow or other got him into the car, took him up a desperately long, lonely bush track, had his way with him sexually, and then inflicted massive injuries to his head with a rock. We visited the key sites, the sites where the bodies had been left, the sites where some clothing had been secreted. The photographs we took show him being absolutely relaxed, smoking, very distant from the whole activity. So much so that when we were eventually up this enormously long, difficult, thickly overgrown bush track to find the first child, O'Neill stepped on the remains, and it wasn't there he is or there's Ricky, it was there it is. He showed absolutely no remorse at all. There was never a tear shed by him about what he'd done to those children.
Could you explain to me what you mean by it would never have happened? The charge that arose to bring you in here?
Well, the charge was murder, and the victim was a child. And later on, thinking about it, I felt very sorry for that jury, because that court could not have made a decision, an accurate decision, because nobody in that court gave them the information they needed to do it. It was a load of crap from both the defence and the prosecution.
Jim's trial was over in 4 days. He was sentenced to prison for the term of his natural life.
See, I maintained, and still do, that I had no memory of the event at all. I mean, not partial or that, there was just no memory of it there. And I think whatever...
After 28 years, Jim O'Neill still uses blackouts as his excuse, even though it came out he'd persuaded his wife to create a false alibi for him. He also disposed of his bloodstained clothing. Later, he led detectives to the body he'd hidden in thick bush.
He may have suffered some form of blackout at some stage. He suffered a major head injury and meningitis, and there were a couple of episodes in the past, fairly soon after the illness, that may have been a form of epilepsy. And that's a fairly high risk for someone who's suffered a penetrating head injury and who's suffered meningitis. He would be high at risk for epilepsy. But I just cannot conceive of a situation where you carry out highly complex activities of abducting a child and killing a child during epilepsy. That would be unique.
Jim told me he'd had at least 8 or 9 of these so-called blackouts while he was travelling around the country. He'd already used blackouts as his excuse in Tasmania, and I wondered what else he was hiding.
I think one of the times that sticks in my memory is I found myself in the Western District of Victoria, sitting on a beach in a suit, in a business suit, with waves washing around me, sitting on the edge of the ocean there, and actually becoming aware of where I was at that particular time. And yet I could not have told you how I got there or what I was doing there.
Can you tell me what period of time was missing?
Well, probably in the vicinity of 24 hours.
When we started to check on the background about the places that he'd been, I think from memory that there were about 7 or 8 kiddies who were almost copybook in various places around Australia who had simply disappeared, never to be found.
Let me ask you a real hard question. Don't answer it if you don't want to. But the question is, do you ever worry about what you might have done when you had the worst period of blackouts? Does it ever worry you that, as you can't remember, because that was the worst period, what other things might have happened?
Well, that's quite correct, yeah. But then again, nothing has come to light.
Right.
After Jim O'Neill had been locked up for life in Tasmania, police from the other states started sniffing around. I got hold of a couple of letters from the police in South Australia, written to the officer in charge at Fitzroy Crossing. These letters made me think, why was Jim O'Neill granted bail in Victoria? And why is it that the police in 3 states never spoke to each other until after he was arrested in Tasmania? The dates in this document clearly relate to the disappearance of 2 young girls from the Oval in Adelaide on the 25th of August 1973, and there was an abduction and buggery committed on a young boy in Elizabeth the 10th of January 1974, and the previous day there was another little boy that was abducted and raped. The second document is addressed to Sergeant Sharrett. In part, this document reads, "We have been chasing O'Neill ever since he was released on bail in Melbourne several years ago on 13 charges of abduction and indecent assault on young boys. He changed his name and skipped to the west, and now, as you know, has run the full course and killed 2 boys in Tassie, and it is anybody's guess how many other kids he's interfered with during his travels. For some reason or another, he denies ever having been to South Australia." The thing I found interesting is that the South Australia police had been looking for O'Neill since he jumped bail in 1971. That was before the incidents referred to in the letters. It got me thinking, maybe they wanted to talk to him about something else. Something that occurred when he was travelling between Melbourne and Cooper Pedy in the mid-60s.
The disappearance of the Beaumont children from Glenelg Beach in Adelaide is the most baffling mystery in Australian criminal history. It was Australia Day in 1966, and the temperature was over 40 degrees. The 3 children, aged 9, 7 and 4, went to the beach and were never seen again. One of the last sightings of them was in a beachside milk bar.
In my travels, I'd come across people who told me that Jim O'Neill had confessed that he was involved in the disappearance of the Beaumont children. Unfortunately, the original witnesses were dead, so I travelled to Adelaide to talk to Brian Swan, who's in charge of the Beaumont investigation.
On page 3 here, we're dealing in opals from Cooperpedia. As you know, Cooperpedia is in South Australia. Is this where the possible Beaumont connection comes in? His movements in South Australia?
Yes, he was fascinated, greatly fascinated with Cooperpedia, and he brought the topic up on numerous occasions. And he never once mentioned Adelaide whatsoever. He spoke about going from Melbourne to Cooperpedia, and possibly 2 years after I'd been commenced visiting him, I said to him, "Where does the road run between Cooperpedia and Melbourne?" He said, "Oh, you've got to go through Adelaide." And that was the first time that he'd ever mentioned Adelaide, and I thought that was a peculiar thing.
Do you have him in South Australia in 1966? I note here it's just got the late 60s and early 70s.
Definitely from 65 and 66.
Specifically, has he mentioned anything about the disappearance of the Beaumont children?
I said to him on one occasion that I had heard that he had told other people that he was responsible for the murder of the Beaumont children in 1966. And his response to me was, "I couldn't have done that. I was in Melbourne at the time." The point that stuck in my mind was he didn't deny it. I don't know if Jim O'Neill killed the Beaumont children or not. I know he told others he did it. I can certainly put him in South Australia in 1966. I also know that in all the time he talked about his travels, he never once mentioned Adelaide. He was barely 19 in 1966, but you've got to remember, he was only 15 at the time of the incident at Joanna River in 1962. The Joanna River area holds special significance to Jim O'Neill. He's talked about it so many times. Mostly he was talking about fishing and hunting. Although in my view, when he talks about those things, he's actually talking about killing.
I watched them pack and I watched them come up the driveway past the cow yard. There was a knock on the door. My mother went to the door. She came back in and said that Leigh wanted to talk to me. And I went to the door and he asked me to step outside, shut the door behind me, and over to the side a bit where there was an old tank. We stood there and he asked me, had I told anyone, and I either shook my head and said no. And he said, "We buried him." And I must have asked where, because I remember him saying across the river from where we camped. And that was, I asked was the other boy with him, and then he looked over and I saw the car parked over on the drive. And he was sitting watching us. Then he looked away and then Leigh said he had to go and he went over and got in the car and they drove off. I watched them go up the road and disappear out of sight. And it was then after school, the weekend, in the next few days anyway, I went looking down along the river, went walking, looking for what could be a grave.
I felt that my best chance of proving that Jim had killed other children would be found on the dairy farm at Joanna. I contacted the Victoria Police and told them I was going to try and locate a body. The search area covered about half an acre of floodplain. It was badly overgrown with weeds and blackberries. The willow trees that lined the river when Jim and his mate were there in 1962 had recently been cut down and piled into windrows.
You see that, Tony?
What do you think that is, Keith?
Oh, well, pretty good sign, I think.
He says it was here that he had his biggest blackout ever. When he woke up, he was sitting on the beach. Waves were washing around him. His clothes were muddy and torn, as if he'd been digging. He claimed he had no idea how he got there and reckons that he'd been missing for more than 24 hours. The experts I've spoken to about his so-called blackouts all agree. It's a code that he uses to describe a period of time when he's committed serious offences. "40 years is a long time for a small body to be buried. It's possible we missed finding it by centimetres, or even that Jim moved it at a later time. Whatever the case, I'm still convinced that when he was 15 years old, something significant happened here. Maybe even his first taste of murder.
Psychopaths are people who like to control other human beings, who often like to control life and death, and here you have a situation of a man who's nurturing worms but then feeds them to rodents, and the symbolism for a psychopath in that is enormous.
He'll tell you as much as he wants you to know at particular times, but I've got no doubt that he's got an inherent ability to persuade himself that he's absolutely guilty of nothing.
Jim and you both fish and hunt, but Jim goes one step further. He hunts for humans too. He did it when he killed those two boys, and I think he's done it in the past.
Earlier this year, I went out to Hayes to talk to Jim O'Neill. I wanted to ask him some questions about the things people had said about him. He lost his temper and stormed off shouting, "I'm putting an end to this. You're trying to set me up." Over 3 years, Jim and I did a lot of talking. But for the moment, it looks like my questions are going to remain unanswered. They'll probably never be answered, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop asking. Fishing creeks, small rivers, is my greatest love, where you can read the water and work out where the fish will be lying or is most likely to be lying, and using a small hook. Most likely I'll only use one worm.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I think back of the best fish, it's especially the best fish I've caught down here. I've been stargazing or not taking much notice at all, but I've just lobbed a lure, just a Tassie devil or something that you can get a bit of distance with. There was no finesse, no skill, if you like, involved at all. I mean, that lure hit the water near a hungry salmon. If you couldn't care less, if you just stick a worm on an ordinary rig.
James Ryan O'Neill is now 56 years old. He has served 28 years in prison and is currently Tasmania's longest-serving prisoner for a single offence. His last application for parole was in 1996. In that report, there is an excerpt from a letter written by the Crown Advocate in 1975. In my opinion, this man is a very dangerous man indeed, and any question of his release should be approached very cautiously. Further, any person considering the release of O'Neill should, in my opinion, make inquiries of the police in Victoria and Western Australia.
Next week, witness the bizarre and sometimes violent behaviour in The Secret Lives of Sleepwalkers, 8:30 next Thursday night. And on Monday, Four Corners explores the tragic toll of dementia, which affects more than 1 million Australian sufferers, to say nothing of their carers and loved ones. Four Corners, 8:30 Monday night on ABC. Stay with us now for Late Line, followed by Late Line Business.